Whispers of History.
It was the winter of 1892 in the quiet rural hills of Vermont, when a story began to take shape that would leave its mark not only on the people who lived there, but on the way history would remember the town itself. In that season, when snow pressed heavy on rooftops and the nights stretched on endlessly, a family carried a burden far darker than the cold. Their neighbors whispered of strange behavior, of illness that seemed to creep from one body to the next, and of something far more unsettling, the rumors that inside their farmhouse, the dead and the living shared the same narrow walls. Picture the scene: a two-story clapboard house, its windows frosted over, the scent of smoke from the wood stove escaping into the sharp air. From the outside, it looked ordinary, a family home like any other in rural Vermont. But behind those walls, grief lingered in physical form. For days, sometimes longer, the bodies of loved ones who had succumbed to a wasting sickness were not carried away immediately. They remained inside, under the same roof, as if death had not yet claimed its final separation. And the family, too poor, too frightened, or perhaps too bound by tradition, continued their daily lives in the presence of corpses. They ate, they prayed, and at night, they lay down to rest only a few feet from the silent forms of the dead. The family at the center of this story was not unique in their suffering. The 19th century in America, especially in rural New England, was a world still haunted by disease, poverty, and fear. Tuberculosis, called consumption then, ravaged households without mercy. Its victims wasted away slowly, coughing blood, pale and skeletal, until death took them after weeks or months of agony. Whole families were swallowed up by it, and in places like Vermont, superstition often tried to explain what science could not yet control. But in this family's case, what they did in their desperation would make them stand apart, forever etched into a chapter of America's darker past. When a child died, there were no quick burials in winter. The ground was frozen solid and cemeteries could not be easily opened. In many towns, families kept the bodies of their dead in outbuildings, sheds, or even barns until spring thaw allowed the digging of graves. But in this home, the bodies were not taken away to a cold barn. They remained in the very rooms where life carried on. Imagine a mother tucking her surviving children into bed, their small bodies trembling under quilts as the shadow of their siblings' still form lay in the same chamber. Imagine a husband, gaunt with grief, sitting silently by the fire while upstairs, his wife's lifeless body rested on the bed where she had once lain beside him. The neighbors noticed. They always notice in small towns. The stories spread quietly at first, in church pews and at the general store. Whispers of a family unwilling to part with the dead. Some said it was grief that chained them to the bodies. Others believed it was ritual, some strange holdover from old country traditions. And still others claimed something more sinister, that they feared the spirits of the dead would rise and punish them if not kept close, or that illness could be held at bay if the dead were watched carefully. For the children of this family, the memory of those nights would never fade, the sound of coughing that never stopped until it was silenced forever, the strange stillness that followed, the creak of the floorboards when someone entered the room, unsure if they were disturbing the living or standing too near the dead. There was no clean division between life and death within those walls, only a fragile boundary blurred by necessity and superstition. But this story is not only about one family's suffering, it is also about the world in which they lived. A time when medicine was still fumbling in the dark, when science clashed with folklore, and when the line between ritual and survival was dangerously thin. It was a period when the human body, in life and in death, became the center of fear and speculation. And in Vermont, in that cold winter of 1892, one family would embody that fear more vividly than anyone else. As we begin this tale, let us not imagine it as a legend told for thrill alone. It was lived. These were real people, bound by love, by desperation, and by the crushing weight of disease. Their nights beside the corpses of their kin were not born from madness, but from circumstance. Circumstances we, today, may struggle to understand. Yet in the telling we come closer not just to their tragedy, but to the fragile human condition itself, where survival often demanded choices that blurred the line between the natural and the unthinkable. And so we step quietly into that house, the door creaking open to reveal a family surrounded by shadows. The fire glows faintly in the hearth, casting long shapes across the wooden walls. Somewhere upstairs, the silence of death hangs heavy, while downstairs the living try to hold on, their breaths clouding the air in the cold. In this place, the ordinary rhythms of life continued against the extraordinary presence of death, and a family that slept beside corpses would forever be remembered as part of America's dark history. To understand why a family in rural Vermont would find themselves living and sleeping beside the bodies of their deceased kin in the year 1892, we need to look closer at the world they inhabited. America at the end of the 19th century was a nation caught between two eras, the old traditions of rural survival and the emerging promises of science and industry. For the families scattered across the hills and valleys of Vermont, life was shaped by isolation, poverty, and an ever-present awareness of death. Vermont in the late 1800s was not the bustling, urban America of factories and steel mills. It was a state of small towns, farmsteads, and tight-knit communities. Families lived off the land, raising crops and animals to sustain themselves through long winters. Their lives were dictated by the seasons, and winter was the harshest of all. Snow would blanket the countryside for months, cutting off many families from their neighbors. Roads became impassable, rivers froze, and the land itself hardened into ice. In such conditions, when death struck, burying the body was not always immediately possible. Cemeteries were locked beneath frozen earth. The shovel could not break the ground, and even if it could, the journey to the graveyard might be impossible. This practical reality shaped customs around death that today feel deeply unsettling. Families sometimes stored bodies in sheds, barns, or even designated holding vaults built into cemeteries for winter storage. Yet not every family had access to such structures, and not all chose to send their dead outside the home. The family at the center of our story was one of them. Whether through necessity or choice, they lived with the bodies of their departed loved ones under the same roof, waiting for spring to open the ground again. But there was another layer to this practice, one tied not just to the earth but to the beliefs of the people themselves. In the 19th century, medicine was still learning how disease worked. Germ theory, the idea that illness spread through microscopic organisms, was only just gaining acceptance. Many rural families did not trust it, holding instead to older explanations rooted in superstition and folklore. Illnesses like tuberculosis, which devastated entire households, were often seen not simply as medical misfortunes, but as curses, plagues, or even punishments. In New England, tuberculosis was often called consumption because it seemed to consume the body from within. Victims wasted away, becoming pale and skeletal, coughing blood until their bodies could endure no more. The appearance of consumption lent itself to a chilling belief that the dead could drain the life of the living. In towns across Vermont and neighboring states, stories spread that the spirit of a recently deceased family member might rise from the grave or linger within the corpse to feed on surviving relatives. This belief led to a disturbing ritual that became known as the New England vampire panic. Families, desperate to protect themselves, would exhume the bodies of their loved ones, searching for signs of lingering life within the corpse. If they found blood in the heart or organs that seemed too fresh, they would burn them, believing it was the only way to break the curse and save the living. While this may sound like medieval superstition, it was happening in the late 19th century, not in some distant dark age. It reflected the fear and desperation of families who saw loved one after loved one fall to tuberculosis. In some cases, entire lineages were wiped out, leaving only a single survivor. And for the community, it was easier to believe in a malevolent force, the hungry dead, than to accept an invisible, uncontrollable disease. The family in our story lived within this cultural landscape. Their world was not built on the medical certainty we know today, but on the fragile boundary between tradition and change. They lived in a Vermont farmhouse where superstition was whispered as often as scripture, and where a family's survival depended not just on strength, but on faith and ritual. Social life in rural Vermont was deeply shaped by religion. Churches were often the center of community, where neighbors came together not just to worship, but to share news, to barter, and to support one another in times of crisis. Yet even here, the presence of death was constant. Sermons often warned of mortality, reminding congregants that life was fleeting and the grave inevitable. Against such a backdrop, death was not hidden away as it often is today. It was present, visible, and unavoidable. In many homes, wakes were held in the parlor. The body of the deceased would remain in the house for days as relatives, friends, and neighbors came to pay their respects. Death was not sanitized or removed. It was a part of life. For children, growing up around the dead was not unusual. They saw their grandparents, their siblings, even their parents laid out in familiar rooms before being taken to the cemetery. But what set this family apart was the length of time they kept the dead close. Not days, but weeks, sometimes longer. Through the harsh winter months when the earth itself forbade burial, economics played its role too. Rural families in Vermont often struggled with poverty. They did not always have the means to transport a body to a cemetery in another town or to pay for specialized storage. They made do with what they had, even if it meant enduring the unsettling presence of death within their own homes. Imagine then the mixture of fear, practicality, and belief that shaped the choices of this family. They were not simply clinging to corpses out of madness or cruelty. They were navigating a world where science was uncertain, where tradition carried weight, and where the landscape itself imposed cruel restrictions. Their story is unsettling precisely because it was not unique. It was part of a broader history of how communities coped with death in a time when disease struck mercilessly, when superstition provided answers medicine could not, and when the dead were not always far from the living. This is the world into which our story unfolds, a world where illness spread silently through families, where fear and ritual guided the living, and where one family's desperate choices would leave them remembered as the ones who slept beside corpses. The story of the Vermont family who slept beside corpses does not unfold in a single night. It stretches across months of illness, loss, and desperate choices, each incident layering onto the next until the house itself became a boundary between two worlds, one of the living and one of the dead. What follows is not a tale of swift tragedy, but of a family slowly consumed, each event dragging them deeper into despair. It began, as so many tragedies did in 19th century Vermont, with a cough. At first it was small and easily ignored, a rasp in the chest of the eldest daughter, Mary. But the cough grew harsher, tearing at her lungs until spots of blood appeared on her handkerchief. The family tried herbal teas, poultices, and prayers whispered by candlelight, but the disease would not let her go. Mary grew pale, her cheeks hollow, her once strong frame wasting away, until she was only a shadow of the girl she had been. At night, the house fell silent, but for the sound of her choking gasps echoing through the thin walls. Her younger siblings lay awake, listening, not daring to move beneath the quilts, afraid that at any moment her breath would stop. When Mary died, it was the middle of winter. Snow pressed heavy against the windows and the ground outside was locked in ice. The family gathered around her bed, grief tightening their throats. But there was no burial to be had. The cemetery was closed for the season, the earth too frozen to dig. They washed her body, dressed her in her best gown, and laid her out in the upstairs bedroom. Days passed, then weeks, and still Mary remained. The parents kept vigil by her side, lighting candles each evening, as if her soul might still be comforted by their presence. The children whispered to one another in the dark, their eyes darting toward the still figure in the room above. Soon, the sickness claimed another. The mother began to cough, her body racked by the same fever and weakness that had taken her daughter. Some nights she wandered the house in a fever dream, clutching her chest, calling out Mary's name. The younger children watched with wide, frightened eyes as she collapsed near the hearth, her breath shallow, her skin clammy with sweat. Within weeks, she too was gone. The father, broken and weary, laid her beside Mary in the upstairs chamber, covering her with a linen sheet. Now two silent figures kept company in the cold house, while the living carried on beneath them. The neighbors began to murmur. Why had the family not removed the bodies to the outbuilding as others did in winter? Why did they remain under the same roof? Some whispered that the father had lost his mind from grief. Others said he feared the spirits would wander if they were not kept close. Still others suggested something darker, that the family had fallen under the old belief that the dead, if not watched, could rise to drain the life of the living. Whatever the reason, the decision bound the surviving children to a home where death walked the hallways. The illness did not stop. One by one, the children began to falter. Little Samuel was the next to weaken. His once bright laughter faded into wheezing, his nights spent curled on a thin mattress, coughing until his lips were stained with blood. The others watched helplessly as he dwindled. When death finally took him, there was no surprise, only dread. His body, small and frail, was laid beside his sister and mother. Now 3 corpses shared the upper floor, their presence pressing down on the surviving family like the weight of the snow upon the roof. By now, the house had taken on a stifling atmosphere. The smell of sickness lingered in every room, mingled with the faint metallic tang of decay. The surviving children struggled to sleep, their dreams filled with the faces of their dead kin. At night, when the wind howled outside, they imagined footsteps in the hall, the boards creaking under the weight of unseen figures. Their father tried to comfort them, but his own eyes were hollow, his body weakened by the same disease that had already claimed so many. Then came the moment that pushed the family to the edge of horror. The eldest son, Thomas, woke one night to see his sister Mary, or what he thought was Mary, standing in the doorway. Her figure was pale, her dress trailing as if she floated rather than walked. He screamed, waking the others, but when the father rushed to the room, there was nothing there, only silence. Yet the vision stayed with Thomas, gnawing at his sanity. He became convinced that Mary was not truly gone, that her body upstairs still clung to some restless spirit. The other children began to whisper the same, their imaginations fed by fear. It was then that the townspeople's old suspicions turned into action. They remembered the stories of consumption vampires, tales of the dead feeding upon the living. When word spread that 3 bodies lay unburied in the farmhouse while the rest of the family wasted away, whispers became accusations. Some neighbors insisted that the father was to blame, that his refusal to bury the dead was allowing their spirits to torment the living. Others spoke of a curse. The town pastor visited, urging the family to let the dead rest, but the father refused. Whether from stubbornness, poverty, or fear, he would not part with them. And so the family remained in that grim coexistence. Each day the children awoke to the presence of their lost kin above them. Each night they lay down with dread in their hearts. The father coughed blood into his handkerchief, his strength failing. The children grew weaker, their eyes sunken, their movements sluggish. Death, it seemed, had become another resident of the house, seated at the table watching from the corners. When the next child died, the house tipped into silence. Only the youngest remained, too small to understand fully, yet old enough to feel the suffocating fear. The father carried the body upstairs with trembling arms, laying it beside the others. The room had become a crypt, the bed sagging under the weight of the dead. In the nights that followed, the surviving child swore they heard whispers, soft voices calling from above, urging them to join. The candlelight flickered strangely, shadows bending as though unseen figures moved through the rooms. By spring, when the thaw finally came and graves could be dug, the house had become a place of dread for the entire community. Neighbors avoided the path that led past it, speaking only in hushed tones of what they believed had happened inside. Some said the family had invited the curse upon themselves by keeping the dead too close. Others insisted they had been victims of a disease no one could escape. Whatever the truth, the farmhouse stood as a monument to suffering, a place where the line between the living and the dead had dissolved completely. When the thaw of spring finally softened the Vermont soil in 1892, and the bodies were at last carried from the farmhouse to their resting place, the story of the family who had lived beside the dead did not simply fade away. If anything, it grew louder, amplified by the whispers of neighbors, the sermons of pastors, and the words printed in local newspapers. For the small town that had watched the tragedy unfold, the family's suffering was not just personal grief. It was a lesson, a warning, and for some, an accusation. The neighbors spoke first, for they had been closest to the family during the long winter. Their voices were filled with unease, tinged with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Some admitted that they had known the family was keeping the bodies upstairs. "We saw the candles burning late into the night," one might have said. "We heard no sound from them, only silence, and we wondered." Others claimed they had tried to intervene, urging the father to move the corpses to an outbuilding, but their words had been refused. To them, the father was stubborn to the point of madness. To others, he was simply too broken by grief to let go. Pastors entered the discussion with sermons that carried both comfort and condemnation. From the pulpit, they reminded their congregations that death was God's will and that the dead must be committed to the earth to rest in peace. To hold the body in the home is to deny the spirit its journey, one minister reportedly declared, his words ringing over bowed heads. But beneath the theological framing was something sharper, the suggestion that what the family had done was not only unnatural but dangerous. In a society where religion was deeply tied to daily life, such words weighed heavily. Doctors, too, lent their voices. Tuberculosis was no stranger to Vermont physicians, who had long struggled against its slow, wasting grip. By the 1890s, some accepted germ theory and attempted to explain the illness scientifically. It was spread, they said, not by restless spirits but by invisible bacteria, carried in droplets from coughs and sneezes. Yet for every doctor who spoke with certainty, there were others who hedged their words. Rural medicine was still a fragile science, and in the eyes of many townsfolk, the medical profession did not hold unquestionable authority. For them, the persistence of illness in one household seemed to confirm the older belief that the dead themselves had drained life from the living. The newspapers, never missing a chance to inflame, carried the story beyond the town's borders. Local reports described the strange habits of the family, noting with a mix of horror and fascination that the corpses had remained for weeks within the farmhouse. Some papers leaned into sensationalism, calling it a case of rural superstition and linking it to the broader vampire panic that had haunted New England in the decades before. Others wrote more sympathetically, portraying the family as victims of circumstance, too poor to afford proper winter burial, too crushed by grief to act differently. But the effect was the same. The story spread, and with it the uneasy reputation of the town itself. Among the townspeople, fear was the most common reaction. Fear of disease, fear of curses, fear of what it meant to live so close to death. Mothers warned their children not to walk near the farmhouse. Farmers shook their heads when passing by on the road, muttering that nothing good could come from such a place. Even when the family was gone and the graves were filled, the house itself seemed tainted, its walls holding the memory of what had happened inside. Yet alongside fear, there was also compassion. Some neighbors recalled the family's poverty, their lack of options, and their crushing grief. They spoke of a father who had carried the weight of loss until it broke him, of children who had faced horrors no child should endure. To these sympathetic voices, the family's actions were not madness, but desperation. They had done what they thought they must, in a world that offered them little guidance or relief. From a psychological lens, though such language was rare in 1892, the reactions reflected more than superstition. The townspeople were grappling with their own fears of mortality. In a time when tuberculosis could strike any household, when funerals were common and graves dotted every hillside, the sight of a family sleeping beside the dead forced others to confront their own vulnerability. It was easier to distance themselves, to call the family strange or cursed, than to acknowledge that they too might one day be in the same position. Over time, the story settled into local memory as both a warning and a legend. For some, it was recounted as proof of the dangers of clinging to the dead, a tale parents told their children in hushed tones. For others, it was a reminder of the limits of human endurance, a tragedy born from grief and hardship. The house itself became part of the folklore, with travelers pausing as they passed, glancing toward its weathered boards as if expecting to see candlelight flicker in the windows once more, and in the quiet of the churchyards, where the family now lay beneath the earth. Their names became symbols of a broader struggle, the clash between tradition and science, between grief and practicality, between the living and the dead. For the community, the story was never just about what happened inside that farmhouse. It was about what it revealed, the fragility of life in a time when death was always near, and the ways people tried, in fear or faith, to hold it at bay. The winter of 1892 dragged on, relentless and merciless. By the time the snowbanks reached the height of fences and the smoke of chimneys blurred into the gray sky, the family in that Vermont farmhouse had been transformed into something less than living, more than dead. Their bodies moved, but their spirits had been hollowed out by weeks of grief, hunger, and fear. This was the moment when all the whispered rumors, all the unspoken dread, would come crashing together in a climax that left the entire town haunted. The youngest child was the last thread of life in the house. Frail and wide-eyed, the boy moved like a shadow through the rooms, avoiding the stairwell that led to the chamber above. He knew what lay there, though he could not fully grasp it. The outlines beneath linen sheets, the sickly sweet odor of decay that no open window could dispel. At night, he clutched the quilt tightly under his chin, listening for sounds that should not have been there. The creak of footsteps, the rustle of cloth, the faint sound of a cough when no one remained to cough. His father sat by the hearth, his body bent and trembling, a man caught between duty and despair. His handkerchief was stained with red, his breathing ragged, yet his eyes carried something more terrifying than illness: conviction. He believed truly and deeply that the dead upstairs were not at peace. He had begun to speak of them at night, whispering to the boy that Mary's eyes were open when he last checked, that Samuel's lips looked too red for the dead. Whether fevered hallucination or the grip of folklore, the father's mind had crossed a line, and then came the night that sealed their fate. A storm raged outside, snow lashing against the windows, wind screaming down the chimney like a wounded animal. The boy lay awake on the floor near the hearth, while his father, gaunt and hollow-eyed, sat with a candle stub burning low. The house groaned under the weight of the storm, and then from upstairs came the unmistakable sound of movement. A thud, a drag of wood against wood. The boy's eyes flew wide, his small body rigid with terror. His father raised a trembling finger, urging silence. Again the sound came. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing the floor above. The father's face grew ashen. "They are restless," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They do not sleep." Unable to contain his terror, the boy began to sob. The father rose unsteadily, clutching a lantern in his shaking hand. "Stay here," he told the child, though his words carried no real authority anymore. He climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning beneath his weight. The boy pressed himself against the floor, staring at the ceiling above, listening. The lantern light flickered through the cracks in the floorboards as the father entered the upstairs chamber. For a moment, there was only silence, and then a scream, not loud but guttural, broken, as though torn from a throat that had no strength left. The boy scrambled to his feet, calling for his father, but the sound of struggle overhead froze him in place. A crash of wood, the shatter of glass, and then silence again. When neighbors, alarmed by the storm and by the absence of smoke from the chimney the next morning, forced open the door, what they found inside was worse than anything they had imagined. The boy was crouched by the hearth, his face pale as bone, his body limp with exhaustion. His eyes were vacant, wide with terror. He could not speak at first, only tremble, pointing weakly toward the stairs. The men climbed cautiously, their boots thudding against the worn steps. At the top, the smell struck them, thick, suffocating, unmistakable. And in that room, the truth revealed itself in grotesque silence. The father lay sprawled across the floorboards, the lantern extinguished beside him. His chest had collapsed inward from the force of his last coughing fit, blood still fresh upon his lips. Around him were the outlines of his family, the mother, Mary, Samuel, and the others, their bodies in various stages of decay, linen sheets clinging to their sunken forms. But what chilled the men most was not the sight of the dead. It was the way the father's body was positioned. His arms stretched forward, reaching toward the bed where Mary lay, as if he had been trying to touch her or stop her in his final moments. The boy's words, once he found them, were little more than broken whispers. They came down. They wanted me too. The men exchanged glances, their faces drawn and pale. No one dared speak of it further. They carried the father's body down, wrapping it hastily, while others tried to shield the boy from the sight. The corpses were removed at last, borne out into the cold morning air, their frozen breath rising into the sky as though the dead themselves exhaled one final time. But the memory of that night lingered. Some swore they had heard the father's scream carried on the storm winds. Others whispered that when they entered the house they felt eyes upon them, though no one living remained upstairs. And the boy, survivor, witness, orphan, would never again speak of what he saw, his silence becoming part of the legend. The climax of this family's ordeal was not just death, it was the blurring of reality and nightmare. For the community, it confirmed their deepest fears, that the dead had not been at rest, that the family's refusal to bury them had unleashed something unholy. For others, it was proof of what unchecked illness and grief could do to the mind, how despair could twist perception into horror. The farmhouse, left behind, became a monument to that terrible night. No one wished to live there, Its walls absorbed the terror of the boy's cries, the father's last breath, the imagined footsteps of the dead. Travelers spoke of lights flickering in its windows long after it was abandoned, of voices carried on the wind, of shadows glimpsed at the top of the stairs. And so the story reached its fever pitch, a family consumed by disease, trapped by winter, and undone by their own desperate choices. The father, lost to grief and superstition. The children, victims of both illness and fear. The house, transformed into a stage where the line between the living and the dead collapsed entirely. In that climax, the tragedy of the Vermont family etched itself into dark history, not simply as a tale of loss, but as a warning of what happens when fear, desperation, and death converge under one roof. The story of the Brown family, and of those who slept beside corpses in the name of superstition, leaves us with more questions than answers. When the farmhouse finally emptied, when the newspapers ceased their fevered reports, the town of Exeter was left in silence. The echoes of that winter lingered in the fields, in the woods, in the very soil where so much fear had been buried. For the neighbors, the memory became a warning. They whispered the tale by firelight, telling their children not to wander too close to the Brown property. The structure itself fell to ruin over the decades, its timbers sagging and roof caving inward, until it was reclaimed by weeds and the slow rot of time. Yet even as the house disappeared, the story remained, as if the land refused to forget. Historians still puzzle over the motivations that drove an otherwise ordinary family into such extraordinary darkness. Some point to grief and desperation, others to the power of folklore in a rural community untouched by modern medicine. In the late 1800s, tuberculosis, consumption, spread like an invisible curse, thinning bodies, hollowing faces, and slowly stealing lives. Science could not yet halt its advance, and so the people turned to older answers, buried deep in superstition. They looked at the stillness of the dead and wondered, what if the body did not rest at all? What if the dead fed upon the living? The Browns were not alone. From Maine to the valleys of Pennsylvania, similar cases surfaced, families digging up coffins, searching for signs of lingering life, burning hearts in an attempt to sever the tie between the dead and the dying. These rituals, seen today as grotesque, were once acts of devotion. They were fueled not by cruelty but by love, however twisted by fear. And so we reflect. Were the Browns victims of ignorance or of something older and far more haunting? Did they truly believe the corpses at their side had power over them? Or were they simply clinging to any hope, no matter how irrational, to preserve the lives they had left? Modern science explains consumption as an infection, a bacteria passed silently from breath to breath. We know this now, with certainty, but to stand in that Vermont farmhouse in 1892, to feel the chill air of winter and hear the rasp of a sick child's lungs, is to understand the temptation of the old stories. It is to understand why a father, stripped of choices, might turn to the grave for answers. Still, the mystery lingers. Not everything can be reduced to science. The silence of that house, the way neighbors swore they heard footsteps long after it emptied, the way some claimed to see pale figures moving behind the broken windows. These are things no medical journal can account for. Were they tricks of memory, echoes of fear, or was there something more in those rooms? Something that remained long after the bodies were gone. The family that slept beside corpses has long since vanished into history, but the questions they leave behind remain disturbingly alive. Each time the tale is told, it asks us to look closer, not only at the Browns, but at ourselves. How far would we go to protect those we love? How easily would fear bend our reason if faced with loss that felt unbearable? The old house in Vermont may be gone, but its story endures like a shadow that refuses to fade. Perhaps the true horror lies not in the corpses that once lay in its rooms, but in the reflection it forces upon us. For when the lights dim and silence surrounds us, it is not so difficult to imagine the presence of those who once lingered at the edge of life and death, refusing to let go. And perhaps, even now, they have not.